There are moments in history so grotesque, so profoundly alien to our sense of human dignity, that they feel less like fact and more like the fevered nightmares of a dying civilization. They're the stories that peel back the gilded veneer of power to reveal the rot beneath. Tales of cruelty so specific and so personal that they transcend mere political scandal and become parables of human depravity. In the blood-soaked annals of the Roman Empire, a domain built on conquest and defined by excess, few stories are as chilling or as deeply tragic as that of the boy named Sporus. His is not a story of a great general or a scheming senator. It is the story of a ghost, a living effigy created to soothe the mad grief of an emperor. It is the story of how a human being was systematically erased, his identity hollowed out, and replaced with the phantom of a dead woman, all to satisfy the whim of the most powerful man in the world. To understand this horror, we must not simply look at the outcome, the public wedding, the boy in the empress's silks, but we must trace the path of the psychological contagion that made it possible. We must ask how an emperor's private sorrow became a public mandate for monstrosity, and how a young boy, whose only crime was an accident of appearance, became the final, silent victim of Nero's catastrophic reign. The story of Sporus is inextricably bound to the story of Emperor Nero and his all-consuming obsession with his second wife, Poppaea Sabina. To comprehend the darkness that would later engulf the boy, one must first understand the maelstrom of love, ambition, and violence that characterized Nero's relationship with the woman he would try to resurrect. When Nero ascended to the throne in 54 Anno Domini, he was a young man of 17, his potential seemingly limitless. The first 5 years of his reign, the famed Quinquennium Neronis, were guided by the steady hands of his tutor, the philosopher Seneca, and the pragmatic Praetorian prefect, Sextus Afranius Burrus. It was a period of relative stability and competent governance, a golden dawn that gave the Roman world reason for hope. But beneath the surface of this promising emperor, there lay a volatile cocktail of artistic ambition, deep-seated insecurity, and a desperate need for adoration that would prove to be his undoing. He saw himself not merely as a ruler, but as a supreme artist, a poet, a musician, a charioteer, a divine performer for whom the world was a stage. This yearning for applause, for a captive audience, made him susceptible to the influence of those who knew how to applaud the loudest. Poppaea Sabina was, by all accounts, a master of the art of influence. A woman of extraordinary beauty, wealth, and cunning, she was described by the historian Tacitus as possessing every quality except an honest mind. She understood the architecture of desire and power with an instinctual brilliance. She had been married to Rubrius Crispinus and then to Otho, one of Nero's closest companions in debauchery. It was through Otho that she gained access to the emperor, and once she was in his orbit, she quickly eclipsed all others. She saw in Nero not just a powerful ruler, but a malleable soul, an artist who could be molded. She played to his vanities, praised his mediocre verses, and celebrated his public performances, validating his artistic ego in a way that the stern Seneca never could. She became the mirror in which Nero saw the reflection he most desired, that of a god-king, an artist of unparalleled genius. Her influence was total. For her, Nero divorced and later executed his first wife, the tragic and blameless Octavia, the daughter of the previous Emperor Claudius. For Poppaea, he broke with his mother, Agrippina the Younger, a political power in her own right, eventually orchestrating her murder in a chilling saga of failed plots and matricidal resolve. Poppaea had become the center of his universe, the high priestess of the cult of Nero. Their marriage in 62 Anno Domini marked the beginning of a new phase in Nero's reign, one where the sober guidance of his former advisors was replaced by an escalating pageantry of self-indulgence and paranoia. Burrus was dead, and Seneca had been forced into retirement. Nero was now untethered, with Poppaea as his co-pilot in a flight toward absolute autocracy. Their bond was, by all appearances, intense and obsessive. He doted on her, lavishing her with titles and honors. When she gave birth to their daughter, Claudia Augusta, in 63 Anno Domini, Nero's joy was boundless. He elevated both mother and child to the rank of Augusta, a supreme honor. But the infant died only 4 months later, a blow that sent the emperor into a deep and theatrical mourning. The child was deified, a temple built in her honor. This immense grief was a dark foreshadowing of what was to come, a demonstration of Nero's capacity for sorrow that was as grandiose and public as his capacity for joy. His emotions were not private affairs. They were state events, demanding the participation of the entire empire. The end of Nero's great love story came in the summer of 65 Anno Domini. The historical accounts, primarily from sources hostile to Nero like Suetonius and Tacitus, paint a brutal picture. Poppaea was pregnant again, and after returning late from the chariot races one day, Nero, enraged for reasons that are lost to history, perhaps a petty argument, perhaps a criticism of his performance, flew into one of his infamous rages and kicked his pregnant wife in the stomach. The blow induced a fatal hemorrhage or a miscarriage from which she could not recover. Whether this account is literal truth or a piece of slander designed to cast Nero as a monstrous brute is a matter of historical debate. Some modern historians speculate that her death could have resulted from complications in pregnancy, a common tragedy in the ancient world. But in the court of public opinion, both then and now, the image of Nero's fatal kick has endured. It is an act that perfectly encapsulates the destructive paradox of his nature. The man who worshipped his wife as a goddess could, in a moment of petulant fury, destroy her. The aftermath of Poppaea's death was a spectacle of imperial grief unlike anything Rome had ever witnessed. Nero was shattered. His rage evaporated, replaced by a bottomless well of guilt and remorse that consumed him entirely. He had not just lost his wife. He had killed his muse, the architect of his self-image. The public funeral was an extravagant affair. Poppaea's body was not cremated in the traditional Roman fashion. Instead, it was embalmed with exotic spices, a kingly, Eastern honor, and laid to rest in the mausoleum of Augustus. At her eulogy, Nero himself took the rostrum and wept, praising her beauty and her virtues, proclaiming her a divine being. He ordered the burning of a year's worth of Arabia's cinnamon and myrrh production on her pyre, a fortune in aromatics sent up in smoke as a testament to his sorrow. The Senate, ever eager to placate the grieving tyrant, officially deified her. A temple was dedicated to the divine Poppaea. But for Nero, these public rites were not enough. Statues and temples could honor her memory, but they could not fill the void she had left. He was haunted by her absence, a constant, aching wound in his psyche. He descended into a profound and dangerous melancholy, wandering the halls of his palace, reportedly calling out her name, lost in a labyrinth of his own making. The most powerful man in the world was powerless against his own grief, and it was this toxic brew of absolute power and inconsolable sorrow that set the stage for one of Rome's most bizarre and horrific episodes. It was in this state of psychological ruin that Nero's eyes fell upon a boy within his own household. The boy's name was Sporus. We know precious little of his life before this fateful moment. He was likely a pure delicatus, one of the beautiful young slaves or freedmen kept in wealthy Roman households for companionship and pleasure. These boys were often chosen for their delicate features and educated to be charming and subservient. Their existence was entirely at the mercy of their master. Sporus, it seems, possessed a feature that was both a blessing and a curse. He bore a startling, almost supernatural resemblance to the dead empress, Poppaea Sabina. Perhaps it was the shape of his face, the curve of his mouth, or the light in his eyes. Whatever the detail, for the grief-maddened emperor, seeing Sporus was like seeing a ghost. In the boy's innocent face, Nero saw an echo of what he had lost, a flicker of the woman he had both adored and destroyed. And in that moment, a monstrous idea was born. It was an idea that could only germinate in a mind unbound by morality, unchecked by reason, and empowered by absolute authority. If he could not bring Poppaea back from the dead, he would recreate her. He would take this boy, this living clay, and sculpt him into a perfect, breathing replica of his lost love. The first step in this horrific project of human alchemy was the most violent and irreversible. Nero gave the order for Sporus to be castrated. The procedure, crudely performed by Roman surgeons, was a brutal act of physical and symbolic annihilation. It was intended to halt the boy's passage into manhood, to preserve his youthful, feminine features and smooth skin, and to render him sexually neuter, a blank slate upon which Nero could write a new identity. While the practice of creating eunuchs was not unknown in the Roman world, it was officially illegal, condemned as a barbaric foreign custom. The Lex Cornelia de Sicaris et Veneficis, a law passed by the dictator Sulla, had explicitly outlawed the act of castration. For the emperor to so flagrantly violate his own laws was a testament to the depth of his obsession. No one dared to object. The physicians who performed the operation were not just medical practitioners. They were instruments of the emperor's will, their scalpels carving his delusion into the flesh of a terrified child. For Sporus, the physical agony of his surgery would have been immense, but it was only the beginning of his torment. The cut was far deeper than flesh. It was a violent severing of his future, his masculinity, his very self. He was being unmade. Following the surgery, the transformation began in earnest. Sporus was stripped of his male clothing, his name, and his past. He was forced into the fine silks, the elaborate gowns, and the precious jewels that had once belonged to Poppaea. He was given her dowry and attended by her handmaidens. Nero began to call him Poppaea, and later Sabina. He commanded the entire court to do the same. To address Sporus by his given name, or as a male, was to risk the emperor's fatal displeasure. An imperial fiction was being enforced by terror. The palace, once the seat of world power, became a theater of the absurd, where every courtier, every senator, every servant was forced to become a supporting actor in Nero's private drama of resurrection. They had to pretend that the pale, silent boy before them was the divine empress returned. One can only imagine the atmosphere of surreal horror that must have permeated the court. The hushed whispers, the averted eyes, the forced smiles as they paid homage to this tragic parody of a woman. They were all complicit in the psychological demolition of a child, their silence bought with fear. The culmination of this madness was a public wedding ceremony. Nero, the Emperor of Rome, decided to formally marry the boy Sporus. The event was staged with all the pomp and solemnity of a legitimate imperial union. Sporus was dressed as a bride, complete with the flammeum, the traditional flame-colored bridal veil, and was escorted in a procession through the streets. A formal marriage contract was drawn up and witnessed. The rites were observed, sacrifices were made, and a lavish banquet was held. Suetonius, the Roman historian, records the grim joke that circulated among the populace, that it was a pity Nero's own father had not had such a wife, for then Nero would never have been born. It was a bitter, gallows humor that underscored the public's awareness of the grotesque perversion taking place. The marriage was not just an act of private delusion. It was a public declaration of Nero's power to warp reality itself. He could not only defy law and custom, but he could redefine the very nature of identity, gender, and marriage. He was demonstrating that his will was the only law that mattered. Was Sporus in all of this? History records his actions, but his inner world is a terrifying void we can only attempt to illuminate with empathy and reason. He was no longer a person. He was an object, a living doll. He was paraded through Greece during Nero's grand artistic tour, sitting beside the emperor in his litter, receiving the kisses and accolades meant for an empress. He was a silent, beautiful prop in the ongoing performance of Nero's life. His trauma must have been profound. He was a prisoner in his own body, forced to inhabit the persona of a dead woman, a constant reminder of the emperor's guilt and obsession. He was subjected to the emperor's affections, which were not directed at him, but at the ghost he was forced to impersonate. This was a unique and terrible form of abuse, a continuous psychological violation where his very existence was denied. Did he dissociate, retreating into some corner of his mind where he could not be touched? Did he weep in secret for the boy he once was? Or did he, over time, begin to lose himself entirely, the lines between Sporus and Poppaea blurring into a permanent psychic scar? The historical record is silent on his feelings, for his feelings were irrelevant to those who chronicled his life. He was merely a symptom of Nero's disease. This bizarre and tragic chapter of Roman history was not a secret confined to the palace walls. It was a well-known scandal that fueled the growing discontent with Nero's rule. His artistic pretensions, his neglect of military and state affairs, his persecution of the senatorial class, and his profligate spending had already alienated the traditional power structures of Rome. The affair with Sporus was, for many, the final proof of his unfitness to rule. It was seen not as a sign of tragic love, but of decadent madness, a profound insult to Roman morality, the mos maiorum. It confirmed the worst fears of his critics, that the emperor was not just a poor ruler, but a deranged tyrant who had lost all connection to reality. The story of Sporus became a powerful piece of propaganda for Nero's enemies, a symbol of the rot at the heart of the empire. It was one more nail in the coffin of his reign. The end for Nero came swiftly in 68 Anno Domini. The governor of Gallia Lugdunensis, Gaius Julius Vindex, rose in revolt, denouncing Nero as a contemptible performer and a murderer. Though Vindex's rebellion was put down, it sparked a chain reaction. Galba, the governor of Hispania Tarraconensis, was proclaimed emperor by his legions. In Rome, the Praetorian Guard, swayed by their ambitious prefect, Nymphidius Sabinus, abandoned Nero. The Senate, sensing the shift in power, finally found its courage. They declared Nero a public enemy, a hostis publicus, sentencing him to death by flogging. The emperor who had once held the world in his hands was now a fugitive, hunted in his own city. He fled the palace, accompanied by a few remaining loyalists, among them the ever-present, silent Sporus. The final hours of Nero's life were a pathetic spectacle of fear and indecision. He hid in a villa belonging to one of his freedmen, alternating between bouts of theatrical despair and paralyzing terror. He lamented his fate, famously crying, "Qualis artifex perio? What an artist dies in me." It is a line that perfectly captures his profound narcissism, his focus on his own lost artistic glory even as his world crumbled. And beside him, through all this, was Sporus. What did the boy witness in those final, frantic moments? Did he feel fear, relief, or simply the numb exhaustion of a long-abused captive? He was a living monument to the human cost of this artist's life, the canvas on which Nero had painted his most monstrous creation. When the sound of horsemen approached, Nero, with the help of his secretary Epaphroditus, took his own life, plunging a dagger into his throat. The artist was dead, but for Sporus, the tragedy was not over. He was now adrift, a relic of a despised regime, his fate tied to the very identity that had been forced upon him. Nero's death plunged the Roman Empire into the chaos of civil war, known as the Year of the Four Emperors. For Sporus, liberation did not come with the tyrant's demise. He simply became a spoil of war, a piece of property to be passed among the new contenders for power. His association with Nero and his forced identity as Poppaea made him a curious and valuable prize. The first to claim him was Nymphidius Sabinus, the treacherous Praetorian prefect who had helped overthrow Nero. Nymphidius had his own imperial ambitions, and, in a grotesque continuation of the farce, he took Sporus as his own wife, continuing to call him Poppaea and celebrating a mock marriage. He was attempting to connect himself to the Neronian legacy, to claim its symbols for his own. For Sporus, it was a seamless continuation of his nightmare, merely a change of captors. The cage remained the same. Nymphidius's bid for power was short-lived. He was killed by his own Praetorian guardsmen, who had declared their allegiance to Galba. Sporus's fate was once again uncertain. He then fell into the hands of Otho, who became emperor after orchestrating Galba's murder in January of 69 Anno Domini. Otho had his own deep connection to the story. He had been Poppaea, Sabina's second husband, the very man from whom Nero had stolen her. He had been a close friend of Nero in their youth before their rivalry over Poppaea led to Otho's exile as governor of Lusitania. The historians report that Otho was fond of Sporus, perhaps out of a strange sense of nostalgia for Nero's court or a twisted affection for the boy who wore his ex-wife's face. He treated Sporus with a degree of kindness, a brief and perhaps confusing respite in the boy's life of torment. But Otho's reign was destined to be brief. He was soon challenged by the legions of Germany, who had proclaimed their own commander, Vitellius, as emperor. The forces of Otho and Vitellius met at the First Battle of Bedriacum. Otho's army was defeated, and rather than prolong the civil war, Otho chose to commit suicide, a decision praised by some historians as a noble act to spare Roman lives. With Otho's death, Sporus was once again passed on to the victor. His new master, the Emperor Vitellius, was a man known for his gluttony and his cruelty. For him, Sporus was not a nostalgic keepsake, but a tool for political theater. Vitellius planned to use Sporus for a particularly cruel and humiliating spectacle. He intended to mock the memory of his predecessors, Nero and Otho, by forcing Sporus to participate in a public performance in the arena. The plan was for Sporus to be cast in a gladiatorial pageant, playing the role of a nymph in a mythological reenactment of the rape of Proserpina. He would be publicly violated, his degradation serving as entertainment for the Roman mob and a symbolic desecration of the emperors who had possessed him. This was the final, unbearable humiliation. For years, Sporus had endured a living death. He had been mutilated, psychologically erased, and treated as a political pawn. He had been forced to wear the mask of a dead woman, to absorb the perverse affections of one tyrant and the political ambitions of others. He had survived the fall of an emperor and the chaos of civil war. But the prospect of being displayed and defiled in the arena, of having his ultimate suffering turned into a public spectacle for the jeering masses, was a horror beyond endurance. It was a fate that promised to strip him of the last vestige of his humanity. In that moment, facing the abyss of total degradation, Sporus made a choice. For the first time since he was a young boy, he seized control of his own destiny. He would not be Vitellius's prop. He would not be the object of the mob's cruel laughter. He found a way to secure an instrument. We are not told how, perhaps a smuggled knife or a piece of rope, and before he could be dragged into the Colosseum, Sporus took his own life. His final act was one of supreme defiance. In a life defined by powerlessness, his suicide was the one decision that was entirely his own. It was a tragic and desperate reclamation of agency. He chose the finality of death over the living hell of public shame. He refused to perform the last role assigned to him. In death, he finally escaped the ghost of Poppaea, Sabina, and the predatory men who had sought to own her image. He ended the charade on his own terms. His death was not a final act of victimization, but a final, powerful rejection of his victimhood. It was a silent scream that echoed through history, a testament to the fact that even when everything is taken from a person, their name, their body, their future, the will to preserve a final shred of dignity can be stronger than the will to live. The story of Sporus did not end with his death. It became a permanent part of the historical indictment against Nero, a cornerstone of the narrative of his monstrosity. The ancient historians, Suetonius, Cassius Dio, Tacitus, all recounted the tale with a mixture of horrified fascination and moral condemnation. For them, Sporus was the ultimate symbol of Neronian perversion, the living proof of an emperor so lost to depravity that he would commit such an unnatural act. The story served their political purpose, solidifying the image of Nero as a tyrant who violated not just the laws of man, but the laws of nature itself. His legacy was forever stained with this act of grotesque and personal cruelty. The boy he had tried to transform into a goddess became the most damning evidence of his damnation. Looking back across the centuries, the tale of Sporus remains profoundly disturbing. It forces us to confront the terrifying possibilities of unchecked power. What happens when a single individual's psychological pathologies can be enforced as state policy? Nero's grief was not contained. It metastasized, consuming the life of an innocent boy and compelling an entire society to participate in its delusion. The story is a chilling exploration of identity, how it is constructed, how fragile it is, and how violently it can be unmade. Sporus was subjected to a systematic process of erasure, a psychological vivisection that left him a hollow shell. He became a non-person, a reflection of someone else's desire, his own humanity deemed worthless. His life serves as a brutal reminder of the countless silent victims of history, those whose names are known only as footnotes in the stories of powerful men. Today, we might try to analyze the story through modern lenses, diagnosing Nero with narcissistic personality disorder, exploring the complex dynamics of gender and power in Rome. But these analytical frameworks cannot diminish the raw human tragedy at its core. It is the story of a child who was stolen from himself. It is a cautionary tale about the allure of recreating what is lost, the dangerous temptation to deny reality in the face of unbearable pain. Nero, in his mad grief, did not seek to honor Poppaea. He sought to possess her, to trap her spirit in a new vessel, refusing to accept the finality of death. In doing so, he inflicted a living death on another. The public image was that of an emperor and his beloved, resurrected bride, a testament to a love that transcended even death. The private reality was one of a tormented, mutilated boy and a psychologically broken man, locked together in a prison of shared trauma. The very name Sporus carries a final, haunting irony. In Greek, the word sporos means seed, or sowing, or origin. It is a word pregnant with the promise of life, growth, and future. Yet, this was the boy from whom all possibility of future was violently reaped. He was made barren, transformed into a sterile monument to a dead woman's memory. He was an origin point that was forced to become an end, a seed that was never allowed to grow. His story is a whisper from the abyss, a chilling testament to the fact that behind the marble grandeur and imperial eagles of Rome, in the gilded corridors of power, the most unspeakable cruelties could unfold, not for reasons of state, but for the broken heart of a single, monstrous man. He remains a ghost in the annals of history, a symbol of identity destroyed and a soul sacrificed on the altar of a tyrant's sorrow.